Chapter 6, Lipids Screencast 2. Now, the previous screencast focused primarily on general fat and triglycerides, and this screencast is going to be focusing primarily on the other types of fats that are out there. The first thing that we're going to look at are essential fatty acids and why they're important. So these are going to be the eicosanoids. Now, one role where the eicosanoids play an important role is in the structural of the cell. We find them in the cell membrane. They're responsible for keeping the cell membrane fluid and flexible. If we look at DHA, that's actually very, very necessary for fetal life and infancy, and it's required for the normal development of the retina and normal development and maturation of the nervous system. It's also needed throughout life for regulation of nerve transmission and communication. The eicosanoids also have several regulatory functions, ranging from omega-6 fats, the influence of blood vessels to constrict and impact blood pressure. Omega-3 eicosanoids actually dilate blood vessels and decrease blood pressure. So once again, these essential fatty acids have different roles within our body. Now, phospholipids, they are similar to triglycerides, except they have one fatty acid that's actually replaced with a phosphate compound. And so this actually allows phospholipids to function in a watery solution. So most substances we consider to be either polar or nonpolar. Phospholipids actually have one end that's polar, and the tails are actually, the fatty acid tails are actually nonpolar. So the phosphate head is hydrophilic, and the fatty acid tail is hydrophobic. When placed in water, the phosphate head will always face water, and the fatty acid tail will extend away from water. Here we can actually see lecithin, which is a really good example of a phospholipid. Now, if we look at the number one physiological reason for phospholipids, it's the impact it has on the primary component of making up the cell membrane. So when we use that term phospholipid bilayer, so that component of the cell membrane is made up by those two phospholipids arranged tail to tail. The hydrophilic phosphate head will be pointing outside the cell towards water and also inside. And then we can see the phospholipid bilayer, and that's the part that actually is semi-permeable and what is responsible for only allowing things that are lipid soluble to easily diffuse into and out of the cell. Another situation where we're going to see phospholipids is they act as an emulsifier. So what that does, it forms a shell around fat droplets and it suspends them in a watery solution. So for example, take a salad dressing, and if you shake that salad dressing, what you'll notice are droplets of fat potentially. Okay. Now emulsifiers are especially necessary for the digestion of fat and transportation. Bile that's produced by the liver is very important and acts as an emulsifier. And then we have lecithin. Now, in food items, like I said, it will act as an emulsifier. And a really good example is lecithin, which is found in egg yolks. And what that does, it actually suspends fat in batter. The phospholipids in egg yolks and mustard emulsify oil in vinegar to actually make mayonnaise. So we can actually see from a standpoint of food, phospholipids and their role as an emulsifier are especially important. Now, if we look at good sources, now we do produce them, okay? So we do produce our own phospholipids, but if we look at where they might be found in foods, we've used egg yolks as an example. And kind of imagine for some typical recipes, you actually have to separate egg whites from egg yolks, and that's where you're really looking for an emulsifier when you have the egg yolks. Wheat germ and peanuts are going to be other really good sources of phospholipids. Now, if you consume high quantities of phospholipids, they can result in a couple of uncomfortable symptoms, so gas, diarrhea, and weight gain. Now, sterols are the last of the lipid family, and they are a type of steroid, and they're all derived from cholesterol. And one of the things that we see with cholesterol is a ring structure. That's very, very characteristic. Here on the top panel, we see cholesterol. And on the bottom panel, we actually see testosterone, the steroid hormone. Now, the use of cholesterol is important. It's necessary for the production of sex hormones in the body. It's necessary to activate vitamin D. We're going to find cholesterol in a number of adrenal hormones, bile, cell membranes, and also the shell covering of chylomicrons. So cholesterol is a very necessary product, and what I want us to remember here is our bodies produce cholesterol. Okay? Those individuals that tend to have hyperlipidemia, quite often there's a genetic issue in which they are actually producing more cholesterol than necessary. It's not always the cholesterol that someone is consuming. Quite often we're going to see a disorder related to, for some reason, the body producing large quantities of cholesterol. Now, if we look at where we're going to find these sterols, we can expect to find them in meat, fish, poultry, eggs, and dairy products. And as noted already, we have the capacity to actually produce cholesterol in our bodies. Now, there are some sources of sterols. Now, plants make sterols, stanols, and cytostanols. Now, ergostanol, that is the active form of vitamin D. Beta-cystanol, that's actually added to some margarine. And what it does, it helps reduce the absorption of bile and cholesterol. Now, here, what we're looking at are some general recommendations for daily fat intake. Now, there is no RDA for fat. So if we look at the AMDR, specifically we're looking at 20 to 35% of your caloric intake should be coming from fat calories. Okay? That's important. Now notice we have a number of other organizations here that are making some recommendations. Note the dietary cholesterol, less than 300 milligrams per day. That's agreed on by the three organizing bodies we see here. Also the consistency between the 20 to 35% of total calories. Now, there is some discrepancies that we see with regards to saturated fat, with the Institution of Medicine recommending less than 10%. Unsurprising, the American Heart Association has a much more stringent range of 5 to 6% of caloric intake. And then we've got the Therapeutic Lifestyle Change Diet kind of split the difference at less than 7% of calories. When we look at trans fats, one of the things we want to kind of point out here is as low as possible. American Heart, once again, is going to be a little bit more aggressive, indicating less than 1% of calories, so actually coming up with a number. Everyone is indicating that the majority of our fat should be monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. If we look at omega-6, 5 to 10% of our calories seems to be agreed upon by these three organizations. If we look at omega-3, the American Heart Association actually recommends individuals have a fatty fish 2 times a week. And when I talk about fatty fish, we're not talking about Friday fish fry, actually tuna, halibut, those cold water fish in particular. Now, many of you have heard of the Mediterranean diet. And when we look at that diet, I just don't want to present it as a diet. I also want to present it as a lifestyle. And what I've included here, this is not in our textbook, but I found this in one of the textbooks I used from one of my other nutrition courses, and it's the Mediterranean Diet Pyramid. And I like this. Now, one of the things that I like about this, look what they also include on the base. They're including a social construct, okay? Interaction with your family, physical activity. The My Plate and other pyramids that we've seen do not include that, but I think this is really critical. Unsurprisingly, we look at what the base is. Every day, we should be basing our diet around vegetables, fruits, whole wheat grains, olive oil, beans, nuts, legumes, seeds, herbs, and spices. When we look at protein, typically fish, okay, fish and seafood twice a week. on a weekly basis, kind of moderate portions of poultry, eggs, cheese, and yogurt. And at the top, less often, we actually see meats and sweets. In addition, it focuses on drinking water and moderation wine, typically a red wine. We know that there's some benefits associated with that. We know that this actually promotes a healthy lifestyle and has shown to decrease the risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, up to 40% of the calories can come from fat in this particular diet if most of them are monounsaturated. So olive oil is considered to be the main fat in this particular diet. There's basically no limit on the amount of fruit, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, trying to minimize processed foods, small amounts of cheese and yogurt daily, low to moderate intake of fish weekly, and also limiting eggs and red meat as much as possible, and also making sure that you're including exercise and, once again, that moderate intake of wine, and it would be a red wine that's recommended here. Now, if we're looking at how much we need with regards to essential fatty acids, we're talking about 2 to 4 tablespoons daily. Now, if we're looking at a deficiency, things that might happen is diarrhea, a slowment of growth, delayed healing of wounds and infections, flaky, itchy skin, because once again, essential fats are necessary. Now, my lab, he's kind of a little chunky, so he's on Fat Boy dog food. And one of the first things that was noticeable, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If you're on a fat food diet, okay, or Fat Boy dog food, one of the things is probably less fat in there. And one thing that we noticed very early on, it impacted his skin and his coat. So he now gets a fatty acid supplement, and once we instituted that, his skin became like it was supposed to. He wasn't dry and flaking anymore, and the color really returned to his coat based on the supplement that he was given. Now, when we look at the fat take of the typical American, we are generally eating too much saturated fat, and a lot of that stems from our protein. We tend to eat far more animal-based protein than other countries. So that's going to result in a much greater fat intake, and that fat is actually going to be primarily in the saturated form. So that's coming from dairy, beef, chicken, mayonnaise, margarine, and also when we look at a high trans fat coming from margarine and baked goods. Now, trans fats, that's what they were actually invented for. And what trans fats do, they actually increase the shelf life of baked goods. So that's the original reason why they were actually invented. Now, things that we need to look at. So omega-6 fatty acid is typically good, but we're not getting enough omega-3 fatty acids. So that's one of the reasons why the American Heart Association came out with that recommendation of eating at least 2 portions of cold water fish weekly to meet our needs for omega-3. Other sources of omega-3 fatty acids would be walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, canola, soybean. All of these can actually supply omega-3 fatty acids in our diet.